The autumn of 1895 brought with it a peculiar chill that seemed to settle not merely upon the cobblestones of London, but upon the very spirits of its inhabitants. The fog that crept through the streets that October carried with it a thickness I had not experienced in all my years residing in the great city, and as I sat by the fire at 221B Baker Street, I found myself grateful for the warmth of the hearth and the companionship of my singular friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes had been in one of his contemplative moods for the better part of 3 days. He sat in his usual chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gray eyes fixed upon some point in the middle distance that I could not perceive. The violin lay untouched upon the side table, and the Persian slipper containing his tobacco had remained unopened since Tuesday. I recognized these signs well enough. My friend was suffering from that particular malady that afflicted him whenever London's criminal classes failed to provide him with suitable intellectual stimulation. "You are worried about me, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, without shifting his gaze. "You have glanced at me no fewer than 17 times in the past hour, and each time your brow has furrowed in that manner which suggests medical concern rather than mere curiosity." I set down my copy of the Lancet with a small smile. "I confess you have caught me out, Holmes. 3 days without a case, without food, and with precious little sleep. It is enough to concern any physician, let alone a friend. The body is merely transport, Watson. The mind requires—" Holmes paused, his head tilting slightly like a hound catching a distant scent. "Ah, but perhaps Providence has heard your concerns." I listened, but heard nothing beyond the crackle of the fire and the distant clatter of a hansom cab on the street below. "A visitor approaches," Holmes continued, rising from his chair with that sudden energy that always marked the beginning of a new interest. "A woman of considerable means, though she has taken pains to disguise this fact. She has come by four-wheeler rather than her own carriage, and she hesitated at the corner of Baker Street for several minutes before summoning the courage to approach our door. How can you possibly—" But my question was interrupted by the sound of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps upon the stairs, followed by a gentle knock at our door. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," our landlady announced, her expression conveying that particular mixture of curiosity and mild disapproval she reserved for our more unusual visitors. She would not give her name, but she says the matter is most urgent. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson." By all means. The woman who entered our sitting room was perhaps 40 years of age, handsome in a severe way, with dark hair streaked with gray pulled back from a face that bore the marks of recent distress. Her dress was too plain, I noted, for the quality of the fabric from which it was cut, and she wore no jewelry save for a simple gold band upon her finger. Her gloves were new, but her boots showed signs of considerable wear, a contradiction that even my untrained eye could not fail to notice. "Please, madam, take the seat by the fire," Holmes said, gesturing toward the basket chair. "You have had a trying journey, and the evening grows cold. Watson, perhaps some brandy for our guest?" The woman sat, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You are very kind, Mr. Holmes. I apologize for calling at such an hour, but I did not know where else to turn." "You have come from Hampstead," Holmes observed, settling into his own chair. "You departed your home at approximately 4:30, though you did not come directly here. The detour through Regent's Park suggests you were uncertain whether you were being followed, or perhaps you simply required time to compose your thoughts." The woman's eyes widened. "You know me, then?" "I know nothing of you whatsoever, madam, save what you have told me in the past 30 seconds. The yellow clay upon your boots is distinctive to the Heath, and the particular variety is found only on the eastern paths near the Hampstead ponds. The fog has been thickening since 4 o'clock, yet your coat shows the characteristic dampness pattern of someone who was outdoors during the transitional period. As for Regent's Park, there is a leaf caught in the hem of your dress, an elm leaf. And the only elms of that particular variety within reasonable distance are found along the broad walk. It is as they say, then, the woman murmured. You see everything. I observe, madam. There is a considerable difference. Holmes leaned forward slightly. But you have not come here to discuss my methods. You mentioned urgency. Pray, tell us what has driven you from your comfortable home in Hampstead to seek out a consulting detective on a cold October evening. The woman accepted the brandy I offered with trembling hands. She took a small sip, and some color returned to her pale cheeks. My name is Margaret Ashworth, she began. I am the widow of Sir Charles Ashworth, who passed from this world some 18 months ago. We were married for 22 years, Mr. Holmes, and I believed I knew my husband as well as any wife might know her partner. But in the week since his death, I have come to realize that Charles kept secrets from me, terrible secrets that now threaten to destroy everything he built. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the first spark of interest I had seen in days. Secrets of what nature, Lady Ashworth? That is precisely what I do not know. She set down the brandy glass with an unsteady hand. My husband was a banker, Mr. Holmes, a partner at Ashworth, Pemberton, and Cole. The firm has been in his family for 3 generations. Charles was a respected man, a pillar of our community. He sat on the boards of 2 charitable foundations and was a generous benefactor to the Hampstead parish. An exemplary citizen, Holmes remarked, though his tone suggested he found such credentials largely irrelevant. So I believed. But 3 weeks ago, I received a letter. It was unsigned, and it contained only a single sentence. Your husband's sins will find you out. Do you have this letter? Lady Ashworth reached into her small handbag and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Holmes took it with evident eagerness, examining it closely before passing it to me. The paper was of common stock, the kind available at any stationer's shop in London. The message had been composed of words cut from a newspaper and pasted onto the page, a crude but effective method of disguising the sender's handwriting. The words are taken from the Times, Holmes noted. The typeface is distinctive. The paste used is common flour and water variety, applied with more haste than precision. Your anonymous correspondent was either pressed for time or possessed of limited patience. I thought it a cruel joke at first, Lady Ashworth continued. Charles had enemies, as any successful man must, but I could not imagine what sins the letter might reference. I burned it, or rather, I attempted to. My hand stayed at the last moment, and I found myself unable to destroy it. A fortunate hesitation. Pray, continue. A week later, a second letter arrived. This one was more specific. She withdrew another folded paper. It accused Charles of being responsible for the death of a man named Thomas Blackwood. I had never heard this name before. Mr. Holmes, I searched through Charles's papers, his correspondence, his business records. I found nothing. Holmes examined the second letter with the same meticulous attention. The method was identical to the first. Though the message was considerably longer, Charles Ashworth murdered Thomas Blackwood. The evidence exists. Justice will be served. And the third letter? Holmes asked. Lady Ashworth stared at him. How did you know there was a third? Because you would not have come to me over 2 anonymous accusations, however disturbing. Something has changed. Something has frightened you sufficiently to seek help from a stranger. The third letter threatened you directly, I suspect, or demanded something you are unwilling to provide. The widow's composure, which had been fragmenting since her arrival, finally shattered. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she withdrew the final letter. It arrived this morning, she whispered. Read it, Mr. Holmes. Read it and tell me what I am to do. The third letter was longer than its predecessors, and as I read it over Holmes's shoulder, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Lady Ashworth, your husband took from me everything I loved. Now I shall take from you everything he left behind. your fortune, your reputation, your family's good name. And when I have stripped you of all these things, I shall ensure the world knows the truth about the man you married. You have 1 week to prepare yourself. Justice is patient, but it is also inevitable. The second most dangerous man in London. Holmes set down the letter slowly, and I saw in his face an expression I had witnessed only rarely in our long association, a mixture of intense interest and something approaching concern. The second most dangerous man in London, he repeated softly. A curious title. One might almost call it a boast, were it not for the implications. What implications, Holmes? I asked. My friend rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street below. If our correspondent considers himself the second most dangerous, Watson, then he acknowledges the existence of a first. And there is only one man who has ever claimed that particular distinction, or at least aspires to it. A cold hand seemed to grip my heart. Lady Ashworth looked between us with loving alarm. Surely you cannot mean Professor Moriarty is dead. Who is this Moriarty? What has he to do with my husband? But his organization, from the window, methods, and I was struck by the intensity of his gaze. Cannot perish with the man. Then, Lady Ashworth, someone has inherited his mantle. What we must discover. You have presented me with a most intriguing puzzle, a dead man's secrets, an anonymous accuser, and a threat that invokes the shadow of the greatest criminal mind this city has ever known. He moved to the mantelpiece and retrieved his pipe, filling it with practiced efficiency. I shall require complete access to your husband's papers, personal and professional. I shall also need a list of his associates, his enemies, and anyone who might have harbored resentment against him. I can provide all of this. Excellent. One more question, Lady Ashworth, and I must ask you to answer with complete honesty, however painful the truth might be. Holmes fixed her with those piercing gray eyes. In your heart, do you believe your husband was capable of the crime of which he stands accused? Could Charles Ashworth have been responsible for another man's death? The silence stretched between us, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Lady Ashworth sat motionless, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, love, doubt, fear, and something else I could not quite identify. I loved my husband, Mr. Holmes, she said at last. I loved him with all my heart. But in the months before his death, something changed. He became withdrawn, anxious, fearful of shadows that I could not see. He would wake in the night, drenched in sweat, crying out a name I could not understand. What name? Lady Ashworth closed her eyes. Tom. He would cry out for Tom, begging forgiveness, pleading for mercy. I asked him, Mr. Holmes, I asked him who Tom was, and he told me it was nothing, merely the remnants of an old nightmare from his youth. But I knew my husband. I knew when he was lying. She opened her eyes and met Holmes's gaze directly. Could Charles have killed a man? I do not know. But I believe he carried a secret to his grave, a secret that someone now wishes to expose. And I am terrified, Mr. Holmes, not of what this person might do to me, but of what I might learn about the man I loved. Holmes nodded slowly, and I saw in his expression a rare flicker of compassion. Truth is a formidable adversary, Lady Ashworth, and it rarely spares our feelings. But it is also the only weapon that can defeat the shadows of the past. We shall find this second most dangerous man, and we shall discover what your husband was so desperate to hide. He moved to his desk and withdrew a telegram form. Watson, I shall require your assistance tomorrow morning. We shall begin at the offices of Ashworth, Pemberton, and Cole. Lady Ashworth, you will hear from me within 48 hours. In the meantime, I must ask you to behave as though nothing unusual has occurred. Go about your normal routines. Receive your normal visitors. And above all, do not respond to any further communications from our mysterious correspondent. Lady Ashworth rose, and I saw that some measure of composure had returned to her bearing. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I shall do as you ask. One more thing, Holmes said as she moved toward the door. This man Thomas Blackwood, you said you had never heard the name before. But think carefully now. Is there anything, any fragment of memory, any half-forgotten conversation that might connect your husband to a man of that name?" Lady Ashworth paused, her hand upon the doorframe. "There is one thing, Mr. Holmes, though I cannot say whether it is relevant. Among my husband's possessions, I found a small silver locket. Inside was a photograph of a young man I did not recognize. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 2 words, 'Forgive me.' Do you have this locket?" "I have it with me." She reached into her bag once more and withdrew a small, tarnished locket on a delicate chain. Holmes took it carefully, opening it to examine the photograph within. I moved closer to see. The photograph showed a young man, perhaps 25 years of age, with a thin face, intelligent eyes, and an expression of quiet determination. He was handsome in an unremarkable way, the sort of face one might pass on the street without a second glance. "Thomas Blackwood," Holmes murmured. "I wonder, my friend, what secrets you carry, and what your death has set in motion." Lady Ashworth departed into the fog, and Holmes stood for a long moment at the window, watching until her 4-wheeler had disappeared around the corner of Baker Street. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. "A tangled web, Watson. A dead banker with a guilty conscience. An anonymous avenger with a flair for the dramatic, and somewhere in the shadows, the ghost of a man named Thomas Blackwood." He turned from the window, and I was struck by the energy that now animated his features. "The game is afoot, my dear Watson, and if our adversary truly considers himself the second most dangerous man in London, then we must be prepared for a formidable opponent indeed. Do you believe there is a connection to Moriarty?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "I believe our correspondent wishes us to draw that connection. The reference is too deliberate, too calculated. But whether this is mere affectation or something more sinister, we shall discover in due course." He moved to his desk and began rifling through the various documents and newspapers that cluttered its surface. "Tomorrow we begin our investigation in earnest. But tonight there is research to be done. The name Thomas Blackwood is not unknown to me, Watson. I have heard it before, though I cannot recall where or in what context. Your encyclopedic memory fails you." Holmes smiled grimly. "My memory, like any filing system, occasionally requires assistance in locating a particular document. The answer is here, somewhere in my records, and I intend to find it before we keep our appointment with the world of high finance." I left Holmes to his researches and retired to my bedroom, but sleep did not come easily. The image of Lady Ashworth's anguished face haunted my thoughts, and the phrase, "second most dangerous man in London," echoed in my mind like a half-remembered nightmare. Who was this Thomas Blackwood? What had Sir Charles Ashworth done to warrant such a terrible accusation? And what manner of adversary awaited us in the shadows of this case? The answers, I knew, lay somewhere in the fog-shrouded streets of London. And with Holmes on the trail, no secret, however deeply buried, could remain hidden for long. The gray light of dawn had scarcely begun to filter through the windows of Baker Street when I emerged from my bedroom to find Holmes exactly where I had left him the previous evening. He sat surrounded by a chaos of newspaper clippings, yellowed documents, and handwritten notes, his pipe long since extinguished and his eyes bearing the telltale signs of a sleepless night. Yet there was nothing of fatigue in his manner, rather. He possessed that electric vitality which always seized him when a problem of sufficient complexity presented itself. "Ah, Watson, you have risen at last," he said, without looking up from the document in his hand. "I trust you slept better than I, though from the shadows beneath your eyes, I suspect the case troubled your dreams as well." "I confess it did." "Have you made progress?" Holmes set down the paper and rose from his chair, moving to the window with that restless energy I knew so well. "Progress of a sort. Thomas Blackwood was not a difficult man to find once I knew where to look. The Times obituary column from March of 1887 provided the essential details, and the rest I have pieced together from various sources. He turned to face me, and I saw in his expression a mixture of satisfaction and something darker, a grim recognition of the tragedy that lay at the heart of this affair. Thomas Blackwood was a clerk at Ashworth, Pemberton and Cole. He joined the firm in 1882 at the age of 23, and by all accounts was a promising young man with excellent prospects. His superiors spoke highly of his diligence and his aptitude for figures. He was engaged to be married to a young woman named Sarah Hutchins, the daughter of a Hampstead shopkeeper. What happened to him? On the 14th of March, 1887, Thomas Blackwood was found dead in the Thames, near Blackfriars Bridge. The coroner's inquest returned a verdict of suicide while the balance of his mind was disturbed. According to the testimony presented at the inquest, Blackwood had been accused of embezzling funds from the bank, a sum of nearly £2,000. He was dismissed from his position 3 days before his death, and his engagement was subsequently broken off. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. And Sir Charles Ashworth was his employer. Indeed. More than that, Watson Sir Charles Ashworth was the man who discovered the alleged embezzlement and who personally dismissed Thomas Blackwood from his position. The young clerk protested his innocence, according to the newspaper accounts, but the evidence against him was considered overwhelming. You say alleged embezzlement. You have doubts? Holmes smiled thinly. I have questions, which is not quite the same thing. The evidence presented at the inquest was circumstantial at best. Discrepancies in the ledgers, a series of unauthorized withdrawals, all traced to accounts under Blackwood's supervision. Yet no money was ever recovered, and Blackwood himself was known to live modestly, with no expensive habits or hidden debts. Perhaps he hid the money, intending to retrieve it later. Perhaps. Or perhaps the true embezzler was someone else entirely. Had left with us. This means to manipulate the evidence and the motive for 18 years, to see an innocent man destroyed. He kept it hidden among his personal effects, moved to the mantelpiece and retrieved the silver locket. Does that sound like the action of a man who believed he had merely uncovered a thief? The implications of Holmes's words settled upon me with uncomfortable weight. You believe Ashworth framed Thomas Blackwood? I believe it is a possibility we cannot ignore. And if it is true, then our anonymous correspondent may have legitimate grievances, however extreme his methods. But who is he? A relative of Blackwood, perhaps. That is what we must discover. Thomas Blackwood had no siblings, and his parents died within a year of his death, the mother of a fever, the father of what the death certificate terms a broken heart. But there are other connections to explore, other relationships that might have survived these 8 years. Holmes glanced at the clock upon the mantelpiece. It is nearly 7. We have an appointment at the offices of Ashworth, Pemberton, and Cole at 9 o'clock. Lady Ashworth has arranged for us to meet with Mr. Harold Pemberton, the senior surviving partner. But first, I believe we should pay a visit to a rather different establishment. Where are we going? Holmes reached for his coat and hat, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. To Blackfriars, Watson. I wish to see the place where Thomas Blackwood met his end. The dead, in my experience, often have much to tell us, if only we know how to listen. The offices of Ashworth, Pemberton and Cole occupied a handsome Georgian building in Lombard Street, its facade conveying that peculiar mixture of solidity and discretion which characterized the older banking establishments of the city. A brass plate beside the door announced the firm's presence with understated elegance, and the doorman who admitted us wore livery that had probably remained unchanged since the reign of George. We were escorted through a marble-floored entrance hall to a waiting room furnished with leather chairs and dark oak paneling. Portraits of stern-faced gentlemen lined the wall's previous partners, I assumed, whose watchful eyes seemed to follow our movements with silent disapproval. The atmosphere was one of hushed reverence, as though money itself were a deity requiring proper veneration. We had waited perhaps 10 minutes when a clerk appeared to conduct us to Mr. Harold Pemberton's private office. Pemberton rose from behind an enormous mahogany desk as we entered, extending his hand with a warmth that seemed genuine despite the circumstances of our visit. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. Lady Ashworth has explained the situation, and I must confess it has caused me considerable distress." Pemberton was a man of perhaps 60 years, portly and balding, with the florid complexion of one who enjoyed good wine and rich food. His handshake was firm, his manner affable, yet I detected beneath his genial exterior a shrewdness that one did not acquire without decades in the world of high finance. "Please, gentlemen, sit down. May I offer you some refreshment?" Holmes declined with a wave of his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton, but I prefer to proceed directly to business. You were Sir Charles Ashworth's partner for how many years?" 32 years, Mr. Holmes. We joined the firm together as young men, worked our way up through the ranks, and eventually assumed control when the previous generation retired. Charles was more than a partner to me, he was my closest friend. Then you knew him well as any man could, I suppose. Pemberton's expression grew thoughtful. Charles was a private person, Mr. Holmes. He kept his own counsel on many matters, even with those closest to him. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "I should like to ask you about a former employee of this firm, a clerk named Thomas Blackwood." The effect of this name upon Pemberton was immediate and striking. The color drained from his florid cheeks, and his hands, which had been resting comfortably upon his desk, clenched involuntarily into fists. "Blackwood," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I had hoped never to hear that name again. "You remember him, then?" "I remember the scandal, Mr. Holmes. It nearly destroyed this firm. £2,000 missing from client accounts, and a trusted clerk revealed as a common thief. The damage to our reputation took years to repair. And yet Thomas Blackwood protested his innocence to the very end." Pemberton's jaw tightened. "They always do, Mr. Holmes. Every embezzler, every fraudster, every petty thief who has ever been caught with his hand in the till, they all claim to be innocent victims of circumstance. The evidence against Blackwood was overwhelming, was it? I have reviewed the newspaper accounts of the inquest, and I must confess the evidence strikes me as somewhat circumstantial. Discrepancies in ledgers, unauthorized withdrawals, these things might be explained in various ways. The withdrawals were traced to accounts under Blackwood's direct supervision. Pemberton insisted. He alone had access to those funds. The conclusion was inescapable. Holmes nodded slowly, his gray eyes never leaving Pemberton's face. "Tell me, Mr. Pemberton, who first discovered the discrepancies?" "Charles did. He was reviewing the quarterly accounts when he noticed irregularities in the figures. He brought the matter to my attention immediately, and together we conducted a thorough investigation." "And it was Sir Charles who confronted Blackwood with the evidence?" "Yes, I was present, of course, but Charles took the lead. He was always the more decisive of us in such matters." "How did Blackwood react to the accusation?" Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "He denied everything, naturally. He became quite agitated, emotional, even. He begged Charles to believe him, swore on his mother's grave that he had never taken a penny that did not belong to him. It was a pitiful display, and 3 days later he was dead." The silence that followed this statement was heavy with unspoken implications. Pemberton stared at Holmes for a long moment, his expression a mixture of defensiveness and something that might have been guilt. "His death was a tragedy, Mr. Holmes, but it was not our doing. The man took his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions. We bore no responsibility for that choice." "Perhaps not," Holmes replied evenly. "But someone believes otherwise. Someone who signs their correspondence as the second most dangerous man in London, and who has threatened to destroy everything Sir Charles Ashworth built. Pemberton's eyes widened. "You have seen these letters?" "Lady Ashworth showed them to me last evening. They make for disturbing reading. Mr. Pemberton, the author claims to possess evidence that Sir Charles was responsible for Thomas Blackwood's death, not merely through accusation, but through deliberate and malicious fraud. That is preposterous." Pemberton rose from his chair, his face flushing with renewed color. "Charles Ashworth was the most honorable man I ever knew. He would never have framed an innocent man for a crime he did not commit." Holmes remained seated, his manner calm and observant. "Then you have nothing to fear from our investigation. If Sir Charles was innocent of wrongdoing, the truth will vindicate him. But I must ask you, Mr. Pemberton, is there anything at all, that you have not told me about the Blackwood affair? Any detail, however small, that might shed light upon these accusations?" Pemberton stood frozen, his hand gripping the edge of his desk. For a moment, I thought he would refuse to answer. Then, slowly, the fight seemed to drain from his body, and he sank back into his chair with the weariness of a man carrying a burden too heavy to bear. "There is one thing," he said quietly. "Something I have never told anyone, not even my wife." Holmes waited, his silence more eloquent than any words. "On the night before Blackwood's body was found, Charles came to my home. It was late past midnight, and he was in a state of considerable agitation. He had been drinking, which was unlike him, and he kept repeating the same phrase over and over." "What phrase?" Pemberton closed his eyes, as though the memory caused him physical pain. He said, "I have destroyed an innocent man, Harold. God forgive me. I have destroyed an innocent man." The weight of Pemberton's confession hung in the air between us like a physical presence. I found myself gripping the arms of my chair, scarcely daring to breathe as the implications of his words settled into my understanding. Holmes, by contrast, remained utterly still, his face an impenetrable mask that revealed nothing of the thoughts racing behind those keen gray eyes. "You kept this secret for 8 years, Holmes said at last, his voice carrying neither accusation nor sympathy. "You allowed the world to believe Thomas Blackwood was a thief, knowing that your partner harbored doubts about his guilt. What would you have had me do?" Pemberton's voice cracked with emotion. "Charles was drunk, distraught. The next morning, he claimed to remember nothing of our conversation. When I attempted to raise the subject, he became angry, furious even. He told me I must have misheard, that Blackwood was guilty beyond question, and that I was never to speak of the matter again. And you complied. He was my partner, Mr. Holmes, my friend. The firm bore both our names, and a scandal of that magnitude would have destroyed us both. I told myself that Charles had spoken in the grip of temporary guilt, that his words were the product of whiskey and exhaustion rather than genuine knowledge. I convinced myself that Blackwood must have been guilty, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate." Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the busy street below. "You said Sir Charles claimed to remember." "Nothing. Do you believe that was true?" "I believed it at the time. But as the years passed, I began to notice changes in Charles, subtle at first, but increasingly pronounced. He became withdrawn, anxious, prone to dark moods that would descend without warning. He avoided any mention of the Blackwood affair, and if the subject arose in conversation, he would leave the room immediately. The behavior of a man with a guilty conscience, or the behavior of a man tormented by uncertainty." Pemberton spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "I truly do not know, Mr. Holmes. I have asked myself the same question 1,000 times, and I am no closer to an answer now than I was 8 years ago." Holmes turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me about the evidence against Blackwood. You said the withdrawals were traced to accounts under his supervision. Who conducted this investigation?" "Charles did, primarily. I assisted, of course, but he took the lead. He was always more skilled with figures than I. And the ledgers in which these discrepancies were recorded, where are they now?" Pemberton hesitated. They would be in our archives, I suppose. We keep records for 20 years before destroying them. I should like to examine them. Mr. Holmes, those records are confidential. They contain sensitive information about our clients, information that, Mr. Pemberton. Holmes's voice cut through the banker's protests like a blade. A man is dead, possibly murdered by the deliberate destruction of his reputation. His accuser has gone to his grave without facing justice, and now someone threatens to bring that same destruction upon an innocent widow. If you wish to protect your firm's reputation, your best course of action is to cooperate fully with my investigation. If Sir Charles was innocent of wrongdoing, the ledgers will prove it. If he was not, Holmes left the sentence unfinished, but its implications were clear enough. Pemberton sat in silence for a long moment, his face a battlefield of competing emotions. Then slowly he nodded. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. I shall have the relevant records brought up from the archives. But I must insist upon being present while you examine them." "That is acceptable. I shall return tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. In the meantime, I have one more question." "Yes?" "In the weeks before Thomas Blackwood's death, did you notice anything unusual about his behavior? Any indication that he suspected he was being framed?" Pemberton considered the question carefully. "There was one thing, now that you mention it. About a week before his dismissal, I saw Blackwood in conversation with a young woman outside the office. She was waiting for him when he left for the evening, and they spoke together for several minutes. He seemed agitated, and she was clearly distressed. Can you describe this woman?" "Small, thin, with dark hair. She was respectably dressed, though not expensively. I remember thinking she must be his fiancée, though I had never seen her before. Did you mention this to Sir Charles?" "No. It did not seem relevant at the time." Pemberton's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. "But I remember one detail quite clearly. As Blackwood and the woman parted, she handed him something, a small package wrapped in brown paper. He tucked it inside his coat and walked away without looking back." Holmes nodded slowly, and I could see the gears of his remarkable mind turning as he incorporated this new information into the pattern he was constructing. "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. You have been most helpful." We took our leave of the banker and emerged into the autumn sunshine, the fog having finally lifted to reveal a crisp October day. Holmes walked in silence for several minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration, and I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked at last as we turned into Cheapside. "I make several things of it, Watson, though the picture remains incomplete. We have a dead clerk who may have been innocent, a banker who confessed to destroying him, and a mysterious woman who appears at two crucial points in our narrative, once with Thomas Blackwood in the weeks before his death, and again on Blackfriars Bridge 8 years later, clutching a silver locket and staring into the waters that claimed his life. You believe they are the same woman?" The description matches, allowing for the passage of time. Small, thin, dark-haired, now gray, no doubt, and connected to Blackwood by bonds strong enough to bring her back to the site of his death, year after year. His fiancée, then. Sarah Hutchins? Holmes smiled grimly. "That is precisely what we must determine. But first, Watson, I believe, we should pay a visit to Somerset House. The marriage and death records there may tell us what became of Miss Sarah Hutchins after her engagement was broken, and whether she has sufficient motive to style herself the second most dangerous person in London." Somerset House rose before us in all its neoclassical grandeur, the pale Portland stone gleaming in the afternoon light. The great courtyard bustled with clerks and solicitors, all pursuing the endless paper trails that documented the births, marriages, and deaths of the British Empire. Holmes moved through this bureaucratic maze with the confidence of a man who had navigated its corridors many times before. And within the hour we had secured access to the records we required. The search for Sarah Hutchins proved more complicated than I had anticipated. Holmes bent over the great leather-bound volumes with tireless concentration, his long fingers tracing the columns of names while I stood by, feeling rather useless in the face of such methodical investigation. "Here," Holmes said suddenly, his voice sharp with discovery. "Sarah Elizabeth Hutchins, married to one Albert Reginald Vance on the 17th of September, 1888, 18 months after Thomas Blackwood's death. She did not wait long to find consolation, or she sought security rather than love. The marriage record lists Vance's occupation as clerk, hardly a step up from her previous engagement. But look here, Watson." Holmes pointed to another entry in a different volume. "Albert Reginald Vance died 14th of February, 1891. Consumption, according to the death certificate. Sarah Vance was a widow at 28. A tragic life indeed. First her fiancé, then her husband. Tragedy breeds either resignation or determination, Watson. Our task is to discover which path Mrs. Vance has chosen." Holmes closed the volume and straightened, a familiar gleam in his eye. "The marriage record provides an address in Islington. It is 8 years old, of course, but it gives us a starting point." We departed Somerset House and hailed a hansom, directing the driver toward the address Holmes had noted. The journey took us through the heart of London, from the elegant thoroughfares of the Strand to the increasingly modest streets of Clerkenwell, and finally into the working-class neighborhoods of Islington. The address proved to be a narrow terraced house in a respectable but unremarkable street. Its windows curtained, and its front steps scrubbed clean. Holmes rapped sharply upon the door, and after a moment it was opened by a stout woman of middle years, her face bearing the weathered look of one who had known hard work and harder times. "Mrs. Vance?" Holmes inquired. The woman shook her head. "No, sir. Mrs. Vance moved away 3 years past. I am Mrs. Coggins, the current tenant." "I see. Do you know where Mrs. Vance might have gone?" Mrs. Coggins regarded us with the suspicious wariness common to those who have learned to distrust strangers asking questions. "And who might be asking?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes. I am a consulting detective, and I am seeking Mrs. Vance in connection with a matter of some importance. I assure you, she is not in any trouble, quite the contrary. I believe I may be able to help her." The mention of Holmes's name produced an immediate change in the woman's demeanor. "Sherlock Holmes. I have read about you in the papers, sir. You solved that business with the Red-Headed League and the affair of the Speckled Band. Dr. Watson deserves credit for bringing those cases to public attention. But I would be most grateful for any information you could provide regarding Mrs. Vance." Mrs. Coggins glanced up and down the street, as though fearful of being overheard, then stepped back from the doorway. "You had best come in, Mr. Holmes. This is not a conversation for the street." We followed her into a small but tidy parlor, furnished with the modest comfort of the respectable working class. Mrs. Coggins gestured for us to sit, then took her own place in a worn armchair by the empty fireplace. "I knew Sarah Vance for 2 years before she left," she began. "We were neighbors before I took over this house, and she was a kind woman, though terribly sad. She never spoke of her past, but I could see she carried a great weight upon her shoulders." "Did she ever mention a man named Thomas Blackwood?" Mrs. Coggins nodded slowly. "Only once, and she made me swear never to repeat it. But if you are trying to help her, Mr. Holmes, then perhaps I can be forgiven for breaking my word." She took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for a difficult confession. "Sarah told me she had been engaged before her marriage to Mr. Vance. Her fiancé was accused of a crime he did not commit, and he took his own life rather than face the shame of a trial. She said she knew he was innocent because he had discovered the truth, the real truth, before he died." Holmes leaned forward intently. "What truth?" "She did not say, not exactly. But she told me that her fiancé had found evidence, proof of who had really stolen the money. He was going to expose the real thief, but before he could, They silenced him. Silenced him? You mean his death was not suicide? Mrs. Coggins met Holmes's gaze with steady eyes. That is what Sarah believed, Mr. Holmes. She believed Thomas Blackwood was murdered. And she swore that one day she would prove it. The words hung in the small parlor like a thunderclap, reshaping everything we had believed about this case. I glanced at Holmes and saw that his expression had sharpened into that particular intensity he reserved for moments of significant revelation. Murder, not suicide. The implications were staggering. Mrs. Coggins, Holmes said carefully, this is a most serious accusation. Did Mrs. Vance provide any evidence to support her belief that Thomas Blackwood was killed? The woman shook her head slowly. She spoke of a package, Mr. Holmes, something Thomas had given her for safekeeping in the days before his death. She said it contained documents that proved his innocence and pointed to the true criminal. But she was afraid to use them. Afraid? Of whom? Of powerful men, she said. Men who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. She told me that Thomas had tried to do the right thing, and it had cost him his life. She was terrified that, if she came forward, the same fate would befall her. I thought of the brown paper package Pemberton had described, the one the mysterious woman had handed to Blackwood outside the bank. Had that package contained the evidence Mrs. Coggins now spoke of, or was this something different entirely? You said Mrs. Vance left 3 years ago, Holmes continued. Do you know where she went? Hampstead, sir. She came into a small inheritance from a distant relative enough to rent a modest cottage and live quietly. She gave me her address in case any letters arrived for her here. Mrs. Coggins rose and moved to a small writing desk in the corner, retrieving a slip of paper from one of its drawers. Here it is. 14 Willow Lane, Hampstead. Holmes took the paper and studied it for a moment, his brow furrowing. Hampstead. The same district where Lady Ashworth resides. A coincidence, Holmes? I asked. I do not believe in coincidences, Watson. Particularly not in matters of this nature. Mrs. Vance has placed herself within striking distance of the woman whose husband she holds responsible for destroying her life. The question is whether her presence there is merely symbolic or something more calculated. He turned back to Mrs. Coggins. One more question, if you please. In all your conversations with Mrs. Vance, did she ever mention anyone else who might share her grievances? A friend, perhaps, or a relative who knew the truth about Thomas Blackwood. Mrs. Coggins considered the question carefully. There was a man who visited her sometimes. I never learned his name, but I saw him arrive on several occasions, always after dark, always careful not to be seen. He was tall, thin, with a manner that struck me as educated. A gentleman, or at least someone who had once been a gentleman. Can you describe his face? I never saw it clearly, Mr. Holmes. He wore his hat low and his collar high, as though deliberately concealing his features. But I remember his walk. He had a pronounced limp, favoring his right leg. And he carried a silver-headed cane. Holmes rose abruptly, and I recognized the electric energy that seized him when disparate threads of evidence began to weave together into a coherent pattern. Thank you, Mrs. Coggins. You have been extraordinarily helpful. If you should remember anything else, please send word to me at 221B Baker Street. We took our leave and emerged into the fading afternoon light. The shadows were lengthening across the cobblestones, and a chill wind had begun to blow from the east, carrying with it the first hints of the coming evening fog. A mysterious gentleman with a limp and a silver cane, I mused as we walked toward the main road in search of a cab. He sounds like someone from a sensation novel. He sounds like someone who does not wish to be identified, Holmes replied, which suggests he has something to hide or something to fear. The question is whether he is an ally of Mrs. Vance or something more sinister. You suspect him of being our anonymous correspondent? The second most dangerous man in London? I suspect everyone at this stage, Watson. But consider the facts. Mrs. Vance possesses documents that allegedly prove Thomas Blackwood's innocence. She has lived in fear for 8 years, unwilling to come forward despite her conviction that her fiancé was murdered. Then, suddenly, someone begins sending threatening letters to Lady Ashworth, demanding justice for crimes committed nearly a decade ago. The timing suggests that something has changed, something that has emboldened Mrs. Vance or her mysterious ally to finally act. Sir Charles Ashworth's death, perhaps? Holmes nodded grimly. Precisely. As long as Ashworth lived, he posed a direct threat to anyone who might expose his crimes. But with his death, that threat has been removed. The widow is a far easier target than the man himself would have been. We found a hansom at the corner and directed the driver toward Hampstead. The journey would take the better part of an hour, and as we rattled through the darkening streets, I found my thoughts dwelling upon the tragic figure of Sarah Vance. 8 years she had waited, nursing her grief and her suspicions in silence. What must it have cost her, watching the man she held responsible for her fiancé's death, living in comfort and respectability, beyond the reach of justice? And now that he was dead, what form would her vengeance take? Holmes, I said suddenly, if Mrs. Vance truly believes Blackwood was murdered, why has she not gone to the police? Because she has no proof that would satisfy a court of law. Documents showing that Blackwood was framed for embezzlement are not the same as evidence of murder. And without a body, without any physical evidence of foul play, the authorities would dismiss her claims as the ravings of a grief-stricken woman. Holmes's expression darkened. No, Watson. If Sarah Vance wants justice, she must obtain it herself. The question is how far she is willing to go. The cottage at 14 Willow Lane stood at the end of a quiet street, its modest facade half hidden by an overgrown hedge that suggested its occupant valued privacy above appearances. The windows were dark and no smoke rose from the chimney, though the evening had grown cold enough to warrant a fire. Holmes studied the property for a long moment before approaching the gate, his sharp eyes cataloging every detail of the scene before us. She is not at home, he observed, or she does not wish to advertise her presence. Notice the milk bottle on the doorstep. It has been there since this morning, judging by the condensation pattern. And the post has not been collected from the letter box. Perhaps she has gone away for a few days. Perhaps. Or perhaps she is engaged in business. Elsewhere, business that requires her absence from home at precisely the time when Lady Ashworth's week of grace is running. Out, Holmes pushed open the gate and walked up the short path to the front door. He knocked firmly, but as expected, there was no response. After a moment, he bent to examine the lock, then straightened with a thoughtful expression. The lock has been forced recently, within the past day or two. Someone has been here before us, Watson, and they were not concerned with leaving evidence of their visit. A cold unease settled in my stomach. You think Mrs. Vance has been abducted? I think we must consider that possibility. But first, let us see what we can learn from the interior. Holmes produced his set of lock-picks tools. I had seen him employ on numerous occasions when the demands of justice outweighed the niceties of the law, and within moments the door swung open. The cottage interior confirmed our worst suspicions. The small parlor had been ransacked, with drawers pulled from their housings and papers scattered across the floor. Cushions had been slashed, their stuffing strewn about like snow, and the contents of a writing desk lay in disarray upon the carpet. Someone had searched this place with desperate thoroughness, looking for something of considerable importance. The documents, I breathed. They were looking for Blackwood's evidence. Holmes moved through the chaos with careful precision, disturbing nothing as he examined the scene. Indeed, but did they find what they sought? That is the crucial question. He knelt beside the overturned desk and studied the scattered papers. Household accounts, personal correspondence, receipts, nothing of evidentiary value. Either the documents were hidden elsewhere, or our unknown intruders have already claimed their prize. And Mrs. Vance herself? Surely she would not have permitted this destruction without resistance. Holmes pointed to a dark stain on the carpet near the fireplace. Blood, Watson. Not a great quantity, but enough to suggest violence. Someone was injured here, though whether it was Mrs. Vance or her attacker, we cannot yet determine. He continued his examination of the room, pausing at the mantelpiece where a small collection of photographs stood in tarnished frames. Most showed a woman I took to be Sarah Vance, small and thin, as Mrs. Coggins had described, with dark hair and sad eyes that spoke of profound loss. But one photograph caught Holmes's attention, and he lifted it carefully from its place. "Watson, come look at this." I joined him and examined the image. It showed 3 figures standing before what appeared to be a university building, 2 young men and a woman. One of the men I recognized immediately as Thomas Blackwood from the photograph in Lady Ashworth's locket. The woman was clearly a younger Sarah Vance, but it was the 3rd figure that caused my breath to catch in my throat. Good heavens, Holmes! That is Sir Charles Ashworth. Indeed it is. Considerably younger, of course, but unmistakably the same man. This photograph was taken at Cambridge. If I am not mistaken, the architecture is distinctive. Holmes turned the frame over and found an inscription on the back. Charles, Thomas and Sarah, Trinity College, May 1879. The best of friends. The brightest of futures. They knew each other. Before the bank, before the embezzlement scandal, they were friends. More than friends, I suspect. Look at the positioning, Watson. Ashworth and Blackwood stand on either side of Miss Hutchins, and both are gazing at her with expressions that suggest more than casual acquaintance. Holmes replaced the photograph on the mantelpiece, his expression troubled. The plot thickens considerably. If Ashworth and Blackwood were rivals for Sarah's affections, it provides a motive for the framing that goes beyond mere financial expedience. A crime of passion, disguised as a crime of greed. Precisely. Ashworth could not win Sarah's heart through fair means, so he destroyed his rival through foul ones. He ruined Blackwood's reputation, drove him to apparent suicide, and removed the obstacle to his own romantic ambitions. But Sarah married another man entirely. Because she knew, Watson. She knew what Ashworth had done, and she could not bear to be near him. She chose a modest life with a humble clerk over the wealth and status Ashworth could have offered. Because she understood the true nature of the man behind the respectable facade. A sound from outside interrupted our conversation, the creak of the garden gate, followed by footsteps on the path. Holmes moved swiftly to the window, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. "Someone approaches," he whispered. A man, tall and thin, walking with a pronounced limp and carrying a silver-headed cane. Holmes gestured for me to take position behind the door while he himself stepped into the shadows beside the fireplace. My hand moved instinctively toward the revolver I carried in my coat pocket, a habit born of too many encounters with dangerous men in the course of our investigations. The footsteps grew louder, pausing at the threshold. And then the door swung open to reveal the silhouette of a tall, gaunt figure. The man stepped into the darkened parlor, and I heard his sharp intake of breath as he surveyed the destruction before him. He moved forward cautiously, his cane tapping against the floorboards, seemingly unaware of our presence. When he reached the center of the room, Holmes struck a match and lit the gas lamp on the mantelpiece, flooding the space with sudden light. "Good evening," Holmes said calmly. "I believe you have been expecting us, though perhaps not quite so soon." The stranger spun around, his face a mask of shock and alarm. He was perhaps 50 years of age, with a thin, aristocratic face marked by deep lines of care and suffering. His clothes, though well made, showed signs of age and careful mending, suggesting reduced circumstances. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, pale blue and burning with an intensity that spoke of obsession or madness, or perhaps both. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. What are you doing here? I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague Dr. Watson. As for what we are doing here, I might ask you the same question. This cottage belongs to Mrs. Sarah Vance, and you are clearly not she. The man's expression shifted from alarm to something more complex, a mixture of relief and wariness that I found difficult to interpret. Holmes, he repeated slowly. Yes, I have heard of you. Sarah spoke of engaging your services, though I counseled against it. Why would you do that? Because I did not believe you could be trusted. Men of your reputation have connections to Scotland Yard, to the establishment, to the very powers that protected Charles Ashworth for so many years. I feared you would bury the truth rather than expose it. Holmes regarded him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to strip away all pretense and deception. You are remarkably well informed about Mrs. Vance's intentions. Perhaps you would be good enough to tell us who you are and what your interest in this matter might be. The stranger hesitated, his hand tightening on the silver head of his cane. Then, with a visible effort, he seemed to reach a decision. My name is Edward Blackwood. Thomas was my younger brother. The revelation struck me with considerable force. Holmes, however, merely nodded as though this confirmed a suspicion he had already formed. The elder Blackwood's son, Holmes said. I wondered if you might still be alive. The newspaper accounts made no mention of siblings, but the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. You have been abroad. I take it, the tropical tan and the lingering effects of what appears to be a malarial infection suggest an extended stay in warmer climates. Edward Blackwood stared at Holmes with something approaching wonder. You are everything they say you are, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I was in India when Thomas died, a junior administrator in the colonial service. By the time word reached me of his disgrace and death, it was too late to do anything but mourn. I returned to England 3 years ago, determined to clear my brother's name and bring his murderer to justice. You believe, as Mrs. Vance does, that Thomas was murdered rather than a suicide? I know it, Mr. Holmes. My brother was not the sort of man to take his own life. He was a fighter, stubborn to a fault, and he would never have surrendered to despair while there remained any hope of vindication. Moreover, I have evidence that Thomas himself gathered in the days before his death that proves conclusively he was framed by Charles Ashworth. The documents in the brown paper package, I interjected. The ones Thomas gave to Sarah for safekeeping. Blackwood nodded grimly. Sarah kept them hidden for 8 years, too frightened to act. When I returned to England and made contact with her, we agreed to wait for the right moment. Ashworth was too powerful, too well connected, to be brought down through ordinary means. But when he died, we saw our opportunity. The threatening letters to Lady Ashworth, Holmes said. You are the second most dangerous man in London. A thin smile crossed Blackwood's haggard face. A theatrical touch, I confess. I wished to frighten her, to make her understand that her husband's crimes would not go unpunished simply because he had escaped to the grave. But I never intended to harm her, Mr. Holmes. My quarrel was with Charles Ashworth, not his widow. And yet someone has ransacked this cottage and spilled blood upon the carpet. Where is Mrs. Vance, Mr. Blackwood? The color drained from Blackwood's face as he looked around the room, truly seeing the devastation for the first time. Sarah, he whispered. Dear God, what have they done to her? That is precisely what we must determine. But first, you will tell me everything, starting with what Thomas discovered that cost him his life, and ending with who else might have known about the documents you have been guarding all these years. Edward Blackwood sank into the one chair that had escaped the destruction, his face ashen and his hands trembling. The arrogance that had marked his entrance had evaporated entirely, replaced by a naked fear that touched even my hardened sensibilities. Whatever game he had been playing, the stakes had suddenly become terrifyingly real. I should never have involved her, he murmured. I should have acted alone, kept her out of danger. But she insisted, Mr. Holmes. She said she owed it to Thomas, that she could not rest until his name was cleared. Self-recrimination will not help Mrs. Vance now, Holmes said sharply. Tell me about the documents. What did your brother discover? Blackwood drew a shuddering breath and seemed to collect himself. Thomas was meticulous in his work, Mr. Holmes. Every transaction, every entry, every movement of funds, he recorded it all in his personal ledger, separate from the official bank records. When the discrepancies first appeared, he knew immediately that something was wrong. The withdrawals did not match his own records, and the signatures on the authorization forms, though superficially similar to his own, contained subtle differences that only he would recognize. He suspected forgery. He knew it was forgery. But he also knew that no one would believe him without proof. So he began his own investigation, tracing the missing funds through a maze of shell accounts and false identities. It took him weeks, but eventually he discovered where the money had gone. Holmes leaned forward intently. And where was that? Into the personal accounts of Charles Ashworth. £2,000, embezzled from the bank's clients and funneled through a series of intermediaries designed to obscure its origin. Ashworth had gambling debts, Mr. Holmes substantial ones, owed to dangerous men. He stole the money to pay them off, and when the discrepancies could no longer be hidden, he framed my brother to cover his tracks. This evidence, the ledgers, the account records, Thomas gave them to Sarah before his death. He gave her copies. The originals he kept with him, intending to present them to the other partners and demand a proper investigation. But he never got the chance. Blackwood's voice hardened with barely suppressed rage. The night before he was to make his accusations public, Thomas was attacked on Blackfriars Bridge. They beat him, Mr. Holmes, beat him savagely, and then they threw him into the river to drown. The police found his body 2 days later and called it suicide. Case closed, reputation destroyed, and Charles Ashworth free to continue his respectable life. You have proof of this attack?